Hi everyone, and welcome back to another week of Kids Church Online. I hope you've had a great week, especially if you were one of the lucky ones who were able to go back to school this week. Have fun, and if you haven't gone back to school yet, don't worry. Not much longer to wait. I'm sure you all are so keen to get back and see your friends and your teachers. Maybe not. Anyway, we're going to start off our session today with singing our song that we started learning last week. So, are you ready, kids? Let's sing. So keep practicing that song. Hopefully we might even be able to get together at church soon and we can sing it all together. Now, who remembers what we learnt about last week? Let's think carefully. We were with Jenny and we learnt about Paul. Paul was traveling around, and last week we learnt that he'd gone to a town called Ephesus. And what did he find there? All sorts of amazing things happened in Ephesus. The people there practiced magic, and there was all sorts of evil spirits around, and yet Paul was able to do amazing miracles to show the people that God is powerful over everything and that they should be worshipping Jesus the King. Do you remember what happened when sons of a high priest called Sceva tried to use Jesus' name and Paul's name when they didn't even believe in Jesus? That's right. The evil spirit in the man beat them up, and people everywhere could see just how powerful Jesus' name was. And they burnt up all their evil scrolls and their magical books, and they worshipped Jesus instead. Now today we're going to hear more about Paul traveling around, but this time Paul is traveling back to Jerusalem. He's going back to Jerusalem where the temple is, where he started off right at the very start of all his journeys, and this time we'll hear about what happens when Paul went to Jerusalem. Well, here we are. Paul is back in Jerusalem. Here's the temple. Paul came and visited the Christians in Jerusalem, and they were really pleased to see him again and so happy to hear the good news that Paul had been telling so many people all across the world about Jesus, and that those people had decided to follow Jesus as well. Now, while Paul was near the temple one day, some Jews who were visiting from another part of the world saw Paul, and they said, "We know him. He's that one who's been saying these things about Jesus." They didn't like what he'd been saying about Jesus being God's promised king, so they started a fight, and they called for others, and they wanted to kill Paul. Now, a Roman soldier heard about this, and he came and stopped them. He stopped the fight. He arrested Paul and took him away and put him in jail. There we go, Paul's in jail. Now, the Jewish leaders were not happy with Paul either, and they made a plan to also kill Paul while he was in Jerusalem. So the Romans decided the safest thing to do would be to take Paul away from Jerusalem to another city called Caesarea. So they took Paul to Caesarea, and there he was going to have to face the governor who was in charge there, a man called Felix. All right, we're not in Jerusalem anymore. Okay, now comes the trial. Felix and his wife Drusilla were in charge of Paul's trial. Two sides to the story. The Jewish leaders, who hired a lawyer called Tertullus. And over there we've got Paul. But first, the Jews made their case. This is what Tertullus said. He told Felix that Paul had done 3 things wrong. That he had stirred up trouble all over the world. He was a known troublemaker. He was also a leader of a group who did not keep the Jewish laws. And last of all, he said that Paul had desecrated the temple. They said Paul had taken people who were not Jews. He had taken Gentiles inside the temple, and that was against the law. This was their case against Paul. Then it was time for the defense. This is what Paul said in his defense. He said he was at the temple, but he didn't do anything wrong. Can't find the picture. Can't find the picture. He hadn't taken any Gentiles inside the areas of the temple where they were not allowed to be, and he was not the leader of any sort of group or troublemakers or caused any trouble at all. Paul said he was part of a group that always obeyed God's laws, that there was nothing in God's law that they didn't believe in. He also said he believed in the resurrection of Jesus and that he hadn't done anything wrong, and there was no one at all who had seen him do anything wrong. Who do you think makes the more compelling case? The Jewish leaders and their lawyer, or Paul? Well, Felix wasn't sure. He said that Paul would just have to wait for the Roman soldiers to come before he could decide what to do with Paul. So guess what happened to Paul? Paul went back to jail, and he had to wait in jail for 2 years. 2 years it took. And every now and again, Felix would call Paul back in to see him, and yet each time Paul would have to go back to jail. So for nearly 2 years, Paul was in jail in Caesarea, and every little while Felix would call him up to talk to him. Now, what Felix was really hoping for was that Paul would give him some money so that Felix could set him free if Paul would just give him some money as a bribe. What do you think Paul did? Did he give him some money? No, that's not what Paul did. Paul did what he always did. Every time he came before Felix, he used that opportunity to tell Felix about Jesus. He told Felix what it was like to live as a Christian, following King Jesus. And he also told Felix that Jesus would be coming back and he would judge the world. But Felix didn't believe, and so each time Paul was sent back to jail to keep waiting and waiting and waiting. Now, Paul was in jail. Had he done anything wrong? No, we heard at his trial that all the things he was accused of, he had not done. It was unfair that he was in jail. He wasn't being treated well, and yet still, all he wanted to do was keep sharing the good news about Jesus. Even though Felix had the power to either keep him in jail or release him from jail, Paul focused on just telling Felix about Jesus. Now we'll find out what happens to Paul next week. But now it's time for Kids Church Catch Up. So let's find out what people have been up to this week.
What is the worst thing about isolation?
Isolation can get boring at sometimes when you have nothing to do, but everything else seems alright.
What is the best thing about isolation?
Well, isolation, you can stay home, be lazy, be yourself, and go on to online classes, which seem a lot better than normal school for me.
How does a faith in Jesus encourage you during this time?
So that we can believe in him and pray to him until this virus is gone, and that we can trust in him until the very end.
What is the worst thing about isolation?
I think the worst thing about isolation is not being able to go to church and school and seeing all my friends.
Then what is the best thing about isolation?
I believe the best thing is probably still doing online class and having school and not missing out on anything, and I'm really grateful for that.
Then how does your faith in Jesus encourage you during this time?
Whilst listening to Kids Church at home, I know that whoever puts their trust in Jesus will always be safe in difficult situations and times.
Thank you. What is the worst thing about isolation?
I think the worst thing about isolation is not seeing my friends and not going to school.
What is the best thing about isolation?
I think the best thing about isolation is spending time with my family.
How does your faith in Jesus encourage you during this time?
I listen to Kids Church online, and Jesus helps many people, so he will help us during this time as well.
What is the worst thing about quarantine? I can't go to school and I can't talk to my friends. What's the best thing about quarantine? I get a little break from my usual routine. How does your faith encourage you during this time? I believe God has a plan for the future and has control over everything.
Thanks, guys. That was great. And don't forget, if you'd like to be part of Kids Church Catch Up, get your parents to send me an email or call me and we can organise for you to be involved maybe next week. Now, in today's story, we heard about Paul on trial. He was in front of Felix, who was the governor of Caesarea, and Paul had to convince him that he had done nothing wrong. Had Paul done anything wrong? No, he hadn't. And yet still Felix kept him in jail for nearly 2 years. Felix was hoping that Paul would pay him a bribe. He'd pay him some money and then Felix would let him go. But instead, Paul gave him something that was even better than money. He told him about Jesus. He told him about how Jesus is God's promised king and that he is the king of the whole world and will come again to judge the world. Felix wasn't sure. He never really quite believed Paul, so Paul stayed in jail. Now, do you think it was really brave of Paul to tell Felix all about Jesus when Felix had so much power over him? Felix was the one who got to decide if Paul stayed in jail or if he was set free. And yet Paul was still brave enough to share the good news of Jesus with Felix. Now, we need to think about that for ourselves. Sometimes it's easy to tell people about Jesus, maybe if they ask us a question or if they're interested, but other times it can be a bit harder. It might be hard to talk about Jesus with some of your friends, but is it even harder to talk about Jesus to someone who has some sort of authority over you? Maybe an adult, maybe a relation, maybe an aunt or an uncle or a grandparent, maybe even a teacher. It might feel like it would be impossible to talk to these people about Jesus because these are people who can tell you what to do. Now, Paul shows us that it's not impossible, but it can be hard. So we need to try and be like Paul, to be brave, to be bold, and to just be willing to share the good news of Jesus with anyone, whether they have authority over us or not. Now it's time for prayer. We're going to pray about this.
Hi guys, it's Kieran here. So today we're going to be doing a prayer. And I think it's very important we continue to pray to God during this difficult time. We can pray about anything we want to Him. And it doesn't just have to be in this time, or even in Bible study. It can be any time you want. Anytime you're confused or afraid. So, everyone, I'm going to do the prayer now and get into your prayer positions. Dear Lord, thank you that we can still worship you despite the circumstances. And please give us courage to spread the good news with other people, no matter how afraid or intimidated we might be. And Lord, please help us to follow Paul's example, how he fearlessly told Felix what God wanted him to tell him. And he did not stray away from God during that time. So can you give us the encouragement to spread your good news during this hard time? And in your heavenly name, Amen. See you guys.
Now it's time for our mission spot. Today we're going to hear from Jack.
Hey guys, Jack here. For those of you who don't know me, I am a KFC leader at HTD, and I just wanted to share a little bit about my personal experience with mission. Halfway through last year, I went on a school mission trip over to the Solomon Islands, which are these group of islands just a bit above and to the left of Australia. Now, these islands, they don't have as much access to the resources that we do, so our group went over to run workshops with the schools and the kids, play sport with them and just connect with them. So we arrive at Honiara, the capital, and we spend 5 days with the school over there, having a great time playing and chatting with the kids. Then we take this small old rickety plane over to one of these smaller islands called Munda. Now we arrive and it's dark and it's cold and we need to walk 10 minutes through the rain to our hotel. When we get there, we don't know where we're going to stay and we don't know what we're going to eat for dinner, so we're feeling pretty miserable. Now we are like, at least we can go to the school tomorrow, meet the kids and have fun. So the next day we all pile onto the back of this old truck and we drive over to the school, and we notice that something's wrong because the school's gates are locked and there's no one there. Turned out that the principal, even though we talked to them, had, I guess, forgotten, and all the kids were gone out on holiday and there was no one there waiting for us. So we were wondering, what are we going to do, because we had these 5 days and nothing to do with them because we'd planned to spend time with these kids, but there was no one there. So coincidentally, there was this other mission group staying where we were called the Rotary Club, and there were these group of older adults who would ship these resources such as tables and chairs and books and generators over to the relatively unreached islands around Munda. So we decided to help them by putting and stacking these things on boats to be shipped out. And so we saved them a lot of work by just having those extra pairs of hands, and we managed to see firsthand what how much these resources meant for these groups by going over to one of these islands and helping them set up. Another thing that we managed to do was we met this group of musicians and singers at the hotel who were part of this youth group right nearby, and they invited us over, and it turned out that this youth, a lot of the kids had stopped coming and were getting discouraged, and the youth was, I guess, dying. So because we were there, a lot of the kids became interested again and decided to come back, and everyone had a great time. I guess what I wanted to say is, like, what I noticed a lot was even though our original plan of going to this school, that didn't manage to get fulfilled, we managed to find these other things, and God directed us to help this other group and help a village and help this youth group, and he used us to reinvigorate that youth group. And it really struck me how even though you might come across these barriers or obstacles, often that's actually God using them to nudge you in this new direction because he has this other plan for you. So I just wanted to share that story, and yeah, thanks for listening. I hope you guys are doing well, and I will see you sometime later. Bye.
Go.
It's time for craft now, so you should have got your sheets printed already, I hope. Now our first craft today is a sheet that looks like this. We can see Paul, and he's talking to Felix and his wife, and he's telling them all about Jesus and how he will come to judge the world. But do you remember what Felix was thinking about? What was Felix hoping that Paul was going to give him? That's right. He was hoping for some money. Now, if you want, you can draw some money in this little thought bubble. But if you'd like to, you could also do a rubbing of some actual coins. And I'm going to show you how to do that now. You'll need some coins. Now I've got 2 coins here, and I'm just going to put a little bit of blue tack under my coins to hold them nice and still for when I'm doing my rubbing. You don't really have to do this, but it does make it easier. So we've got our coins nice and still. Now we put our piece of paper with the thought bubble over our coins, holding it nice and still, and I've got a gold crayon, and I'm going to just gently colour lightly from side to side over the top of the coin, and you should be able to see the pattern of the coin appear. Now, Felix probably wasn't dreaming about Australian money, but that's okay. Here's our first coin. Now let's do our second one. You don't have to press too hard, but you do need to press hard enough so that we can see the outline of the coin and the pattern that's on the coin as well. So if you can find some coins at home, they don't have to be golden coins, you can use any coins you like. You can make the pattern of the money in Felix's thought bubble. Otherwise, you can just draw some coins or draw some money if you want in that part of the picture. So here we go. While he was in prison, Paul told Felix how to be right with God by living with Jesus as king. He warned Felix that Jesus would come to judge the world, but Felix only cared about the money he hoped Paul would give him to be set free. That's our first craft for today. Let's look at the second one. Now for our second craft today, we need 2 sheets. They look like this. Here's our first one, and here's our second one. Now, as always, your first job is colouring. So colour in the first sheet. Not much colouring to be done on the second sheet, and all this spare white space over here with little glue marks on it, that's going to be covered over by the other page, so don't worry about colouring any of this in. So once you've done your colouring, we need to do some fancy cutting. Are you ready? More windows to lift the flap. So there's one here where Paul is talking. You'll need to cut open this flap so that you can fold it back. One for Felix as well, and then one's up here, up near the top. So I'm going to show you how to cut them now. So remember, we cut along the solid line inside the speech bubble, not the dotted line at the top. So I've got a little opening now, so I'm cutting all the way along the edges of what Paul said. Do you remember what he said in his defense? That he followed God's laws, that he was not a leader of troublemakers, that he believed in the resurrection, and that no one had seen him do anything wrong. Okay, so that's our first one done. And now we need to cut out the ones about what the lawyer Tertullus said that Paul had done. Said he was a troublemaker who'd caused trouble all over the world. That he'd desecrated the temple, taken in people who did not belong there. And that he was a leader of other troublemakers, causing that trouble all over the world. Paul said he hadn't done any of those things. All right, we don't cut along the top, along the dotted lines, just along the sides. Once you've done all your cutting, that's when we come to the gluing. So don't glue the top sheet, let's glue the bottom sheet. Those little flaps that we just cut are going to fit over these spaces here. So do not put any glue on any of these squares, but we do need to put some glue around these other areas so that we can stick that sheet on top. Strip of glue along the very top, some down the sides. I think that's enough glue. All right, now the tricky part, lining everything up. Here we go. That's pretty close. I think it's close. It's not that close. It's a bit close. Let's see. Oh yes, I think it's worked. I think it's worked. Now, the Jewish leaders hired a lawyer to bring false charges against Paul before Felix. Here's what he said. He's making trouble all over the world. He leads a group that doesn't keep God's laws. He doesn't respect the temple. And Paul's defense. Need a bit more glue there. I wasn't leading a group of troublemakers. We obey God's laws. We believe in the resurrection. No one here saw me doing anything wrong. Then when Paul was talking to Felix, he told him, to be right with God, you need to live with Jesus as your king. Jesus will come to judge the world. But what was Felix thinking about? Money. Just money, not about how Jesus could save him. Well, that's the end of our lesson for today. I hope you've had fun and enjoyed doing your craft, and I'll see you all again next week. Bye.